also, as we talk about conspiracies, that there's also a long history of political conspiracies, of diluting the Black vote, right? Of making sure that Black people don't have as much political power, electoral power, as we deserve. And so can you just speak to that a bit?
Absolutely. Yeah. I wanted to first start out by referencing my book, Uncounted: The Crisis of Voter Suppression in America, where in the introduction, I let people know something that my grandfather said to me many, many years ago. He said, when we would say overnight with my grandparents, he would wake us up by saying, "You're sleeping at a dangerous time." And I think that we as a country, and certainly as a community, communities of color, have been sleeping at a dangerous time. Certainly much things that my co-panelists have been saying, that there have been signs along the way, right? That there were things that we need to pay attention to, but we neglected to do so. And now, people are always talking about, I'm stay woke, right? Like we need to wake. And so now certainly this pandemic and the circumstances around it is certainly helping to awaken us, hopefully, from our slumber. We have certainly understand that in regards to elections and voting in the United States modus operandi is to ensure that only certain people get to cast a ballot. Historically, in the beginning of the country, the only people who were allowed to cast a ballot were white men who owned property. And that was until the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And when the 15th Amendment gave the right to vote to Black men, we saw astronomical effects. We saw that Blacks were able to elect persons on the state level, local level, and the federal level. In the 1890s, we had 2 African Americans in the United States Senate from Mississippi. We have not had 2 African Americans from the South elected to the United States Senate since the 1890s. We only have 3 African Americans in the United States Senate today. So from the 1890s to 2020, we only gained essentially one Black senator in that time period. It is 2020, and from those elections from in the 1890s during the period of Reconstruction, there was a very short period where we saw those gains, those astronomical gains. And then in the 1900s, when they removed federal protection from those Confederate states, we saw the violence, the economic terrorism, right? If you vote, you lose your property, you lose your home, you could lose your life. And they instituted things such as poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Essentially, if your grandfather had not voted prior to the passage of the 15th Amendment, then you could not vote. So instituted all these kinds of changes, and those numbers of Blacks who were registered to vote and electing people plummeted. For example, in Alabama, there were approximately 140,000 African-American men who were registered to vote in 1906. After they passed the grandfather clauses, poll taxes, and other measures in Alabama, that number went down to 46 in 1906. So the type of what Dr. King called in 1957 in his Give Us the Ballot speech, those types of conniving methods, poll taxes, which would today, people equating poll taxes, a voter ID as a poll tax, right? Restricted voter ID, only allowing certain types of identification to be used to actually cast a ballot. And things such as literacy tests, moving from literacy tests, and now we have, proof of citizenship laws in some states where you actually have to prove your citizenship before you can cast a ballot. So we saw from the 15th Amendment to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, those kinds of disenfranchising mechanisms were in place. And then from the Voting Rights Act to today, we certainly have made gains. I think Timon talked about some of these cycles, and we see these waves. So we've seen these cycles of progress, and then we see these cycles of regress, and we're certainly in one of those cycles now. And the ways in which they are attempting to ensure that particularly votes of people of color are suppressed. Continues, my grandmother said, devil ain't got no new tricks. And so these things may have different names today, but they certainly have the same impact, which are to certainly decrease, minimize the numbers of people of color who have access to the ballot.
And we know that there have been recent examples of voter suppression. If we think about what happened in Georgia, if we think about the 2016 elections and white supremacists really harassing and intimidating or attempting to intimidate Black voters in places like Ohio. And so we've seen that. I think that there's also some concern about an over-reliance on technology, which we know can be easily manipulated in advance of the 2020 elections. There's concern about, getting back to conspiracy, this all being a setup, right? And, minority vote dilution, Black voter suppression taking place through technology, and also through, how do we know what happens with an all vote by mail election? And so I'm wondering if quickly you can speak to that, and then I'd love for us to get into a collective conversation about what we need to guard against.
Well, certainly vote by mail is something that a number of states are looking at in regards to this pandemic, because it allows people to vote from their homes as opposed to having to go into polling places. We saw what happened in Wisconsin when they would not allow that as an option, that you had lines of hours long. And so essentially what this pandemic has done, particularly in the area of voting and other areas, is that it's exposed the country and expose the disparities that exist, particularly in our communities. Vote by mail is an answer. It is not the answer. We still have to have opportunities for people to vote in person, as well as make sure that we have the ability for people who need language assistance and persons who are disabled also have the assistance that they need. So vote by mail is one answer, but there is a high level of distrust. Black folk like to vote in person.
I like to vote in person. I like to go. I stand in no long line, but I like to go, and I like the little, now they've updated things in Los Angeles and it's all kind of technologically mediated, but I liked the little stamp thing. I knew I could look and see what I was stamping because I don't trust it, right? And I think that that's part of the conversation. And when I said, let's open up the conversation to what we need to guard against, it's coming at all sides. So vote by mail is a problem in the sense that you have to trust that all these ballots are being counted. We have multiple examples from 2016 where huge batches of vote by mail ballots were found way after the fact, right? But then we also have recent examples like Wisconsin, where people had to risk their lives to go out and physically vote.